Welcome back to History for Snooze, where the past drifts softly into your dreams. Tonight, we're stepping into the strange and curious world of the Middle Ages, a time filled not only with knights and castles, but with some truly weird laws that will make you wonder how people ever lived that way. Here, we keep history calm, slow, and soothing, perfect for relaxing your mind or gently falling asleep. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if peaceful storytelling helps you rest, don't forget to subscribe and join our sleepy community of history dreamers. Now lie back, close your eyes, and let's wander through the dusty halls of medieval courts, where justice was as strange as it was fascinating. This is History for Snooze. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was an era of profound legal peculiarity. Modern observers looking back at the legal codes, judicial practices, and legislative frameworks of medieval Europe often find themselves bewildered by the seemingly bizarre, irrational, and sometimes darkly humorous laws that governed daily life. These laws, which we now categorize as weird or unusual, were products of their time, shaped by religious doctrine, superstition, social hierarchies, economic necessities, and cultural beliefs that seem alien to contemporary sensibilities. This comprehensive examination explores the strange legal landscape of medieval Europe, investigating not merely the oddity of these laws but their underlying rationale, their enforcement, and their lasting impact on modern legal systems. From laws governing the behavior of animals to regulations about clothing colors, from bizarre trial procedures to punishments that seem incomprehensibly harsh or absurdly lenient, medieval law presents a fascinating window into a world where the line between the sacred and profane, the rational and supernatural, was perpetually blurred. The convergence of legal traditions. Medieval law did not emerge from a vacuum. It represented a complex synthesis of Roman legal traditions, Germanic tribal customs, canon law from the Christian Church, and local customs that had developed over centuries. This convergence created a legal landscape that was often contradictory, inconsistent, and, to modern eyes, deeply strange. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West left a legal vacuum that was gradually filled by a patchwork of competing authorities. Local lords, the church, emerging monarchies, and ancient tribal traditions all claimed jurisdiction over various aspects of life. This created situations where multiple legal systems might apply to a single dispute, often with wildly different outcomes depending on which authority held sway. The Germanic tribes that dominated much of post-Roman Europe brought with them legal concepts that seemed primitive to those educated in Roman jurisprudence. Trial by ordeal, compurgation, oath-taking, and blood feuds were all accepted legal mechanisms. When these collided with Roman concepts of written law and legal procedure, the results were often bizarre hybrids that combined the worst excesses of both systems. The role of religion in legal formation. Perhaps no factor contributed more to the peculiarity of medieval law than the overwhelming influence of Christian theology. The Church was not merely a religious institution but a legal one, with its own courts, procedures, and punishments. Canon law governed not just clerical matters but also marriage, inheritance, moral behavior, and countless other aspects of daily life. This religious influence manifested in laws that attempted to regulate thoughts, beliefs, and private behaviors in ways that modern legal systems would never contemplate. Laws against blasphemy, heresy, and various forms of moral transgression were enforced with a zeal that reflected the medieval belief that earthly law must mirror divine law. Sin and crime were often indistinguishable concepts, and the punishment of one was seen as necessary for the prevention of the other. The Church's teachings on hierarchy, order, and proper social relations also shaped secular law. The concept of the great chain of being, the idea that all creation existed in a divinely ordained hierarchy, justified laws that treated different classes of people radically differently. What might be a minor offense for a noble could be a capital crime for a peasant, and vice versa. The absence of modern legal concepts. Many medieval laws seem bizarre because they operated in the absence of legal concepts that we now take for granted. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the prohibition against double jeopardy, and many other fundamental principles of modern justice were unknown or poorly developed in medieval courts. Evidence as we understand it today was often secondary to reputation, oath-taking, and supernatural signs. A person's word was literally measured. 12 oath helpers swearing to someone's innocence might outweigh physical evidence of guilt. This system, while strange to us, made sense in a society where community reputation was everything and where most people lived their entire lives within small, tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The trial of animals. Among the most bizarre aspects of medieval law was the practice of putting animals on trial for crimes. These were not symbolic proceedings but formal legal trials, complete with prosecutors, defense attorneys, witnesses, and judges. Animals accused of crimes were afforded many of the same legal protections as human defendants. The most common animal defendants were pigs, which frequently roamed free in medieval towns and villages. When a pig killed or injured a human, particularly a child, it could be arrested, imprisoned, and brought to trial. Court records from medieval France detail numerous such cases, with pigs being sentenced to death by hanging after being found guilty of murder. In 1386, a sow was tried and convicted in Falaise, France, for killing an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing and publicly executed in the town square. The rationale behind this seemingly absurd practice was multifaceted. First, it demonstrated that justice was being served and that even animals were subject to the law. Second, it provided a public spectacle that reinforced social order. Third, it allowed the community to process grief and trauma through a familiar legal framework. But pigs were not the only animals to face medieval justice. Rats, mice, locusts, caterpillars, and other pests were frequently tried, usually in ecclesiastical courts, for destroying crops. These trials were conducted in absentia since gathering all the defendant rodents would have been impractical. The animals would be assigned a defense attorney who would argue on their behalf, often claiming that the creatures were simply following their God-given nature. Beyond clothing, sumptuary laws attempted to regulate all manner of luxuries. The number of courses served at a feast, the types of jewelry one could wear, the decoration of one's home, all could be subject to legal restriction based on social class. In Florence, laws from the 14th century limited the number of guests at weddings, the value of gifts given, and the lavishness of wedding feasts, all calibrated to the social status of the families involved. A merchant could host a wedding with up to 100 guests, while a nobleman might host 200, and sumptuary officers were appointed to ensure compliance. Funeral regulations were equally detailed. The number of mourners, the quality of the burial shroud, the lavishness of the funeral feast, all were regulated by law. These regulations served multiple purposes. They prevented families from bankrupting themselves on funerals, they maintained visible social distinctions even in death, and they discouraged the sin of pride. Footwear laws. The regulation of footwear reached absurd heights in medieval Europe. The fashion for polaines, long, pointed shoes, in the 14th and 15th centuries led to laws specifying exactly how long one's shoe points could be based on social status. In England, commoners were limited to points of 6 inches, while nobles could wear points of up to 2 feet in length. These exaggerated shoes were not merely impractical. They were condemned by the church as sinful vanity. Some moralists claimed that the devil resided in the pointed toes. Laws attempting to ban or limit polanes were passed repeatedly, always unsuccessfully, until fashion finally moved on. Women's platform shoes, called chopins, reached equally ridiculous heights in later medieval Venice. Some chopins were so tall that women needed servants to help them walk. Laws attempted to limit their height, ostensibly for safety reasons but also to prevent the social confusion that occurred when a woman of low birth appeared taller, and thus more imposing, than her social betters. The logic of ordeal. Trial by ordeal seems to modern minds like the epitome of medieval irrationality, subjecting accused persons to painful or dangerous tests in the belief that God would protect the innocent. Yet within the medieval worldview, ordeals made perfect sense. If God was all-knowing and all-powerful, and if he cared about justice, then he would surely intervene to prevent an innocent person from being harmed. The most common forms of ordeal involved fire or water. In trial by hot iron, the accused carried a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, usually 9 feet. The hand was then bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandages were removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, the person was innocent. If it was festering, they were guilty. Trial by hot water required the accused to plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring. Again, the condition of the hand after 3 days determined guilt or innocence. Trial by cold water involved binding the accused and throwing them into a body of water blessed by a priest. If they floated, they were guilty. The water, blessed by God, rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, though they needed to be pulled out before drowning. Recent historical research has suggested that these ordeals may have been less arbitrary than they appear. The rituals surrounding ordeals involved extensive preparation, public ceremony, and religious observation. Priests conducted the ordeals and judged the results. There was significant opportunity for community sentiment and the priest's judgment to influence the outcome. An accused person who had community support might have their hand bandaged more carefully, protecting it from infection. Someone widely believed to be guilty might find the test administered more harshly. Trial by combat. Trial by combat, judicial dueling, was based on the same principle as other ordeals. God would ensure that the righteous party won. What began as a Germanic tribal custom became embedded in medieval legal procedure, particularly for disputes between nobles. The procedure was highly formalized. Challenges were issued formally, often in writing. The parties would appear before a court, and if the dispute could not be resolved through other means, combat might be authorized. The duel would take place in a specified location, often in the presence of the sovereign or their representative, with detailed rules about weapons, time limits, and conditions of victory. Women, clergy, the elderly, and the infirm were allowed to appoint champions to fight on their behalf. This led to the emergence of professional champions who fought duels for pay. The logic was that God would ensure the righteous cause triumphed regardless of who wielded the sword, though this belief was strained when wealthy parties could afford better champions than poor ones. Trial by combat persisted remarkably late in some jurisdictions. In England, it was not formally abolished until 1819, though it had fallen into disuse centuries earlier. The last recorded trial by combat in France occurred in 1547, when 2 noblemen fought over an inheritance dispute. One of them died, definitively settling the matter, though likely not in the way God intended. Compurgation and oath-taking. A less violent but equally strange judicial procedure was compurgation, also known as oath-helping. If accused of a crime, one could prove innocence by gathering a specified number of oath-helpers, usually 12, who would swear to one's good character and innocence. Critically, the oath-helpers were not testifying to the facts of the case. They might know nothing about whether the accused committed the alleged crime. Instead, they were swearing to their belief in the accused's honesty and integrity. The logic was that a person of good character, embedded in a community, surrounded by people willing to stake their reputation on them, was unlikely to be guilty. The number of oath-helpers required varied with the seriousness of the charge and the status of the parties involved. A noble might need only 6 oath-helpers to rebut a charge that would require a peasant to find 12. If one could not find the required number of oath-helpers, one was presumed guilty. The community's unwillingness to support you was itself evidence of guilt. A particularly strange variant of trial by ordeal was the ordeal of the cross. The accused and the accuser would stand before a cross with their arms outstretched in imitation of Christ's crucifixion. Whichever party lowered their arms first lost the case, their failure to maintain the position being interpreted as a sign of God's judgment against them. This ordeal, which sounds absurdly simple, could last for hours and was genuinely grueling. Holding one's arms outstretched in the position of the cross for extended periods causes intense muscle fatigue and pain. The ordeal tested physical endurance, but medieval people saw it as testing spiritual worthiness. An innocent party, sustained by God's grace, would be able to maintain the position longer than a guilty one. Variations of this ordeal existed across Europe. In some versions, the parties held lit candles, with the first to drop their candle being judged guilty. In others, they stood on one leg or maintained other physically challenging positions. The church eventually banned most ordeals in 1215, but the ordeal of the cross persisted longer than most, perhaps because it did not involve the direct application of physical harm. Trial by coercion. In Anglo-Saxon England, accused clergy could undergo the ordeal of the coarsened or blessed bread. A piece of bread or cheese, the accounts vary, would be blessed by a priest and given to the accused. If they could swallow it without choking, they were innocent. If they choked on it, they were guilty. This ordeal seems less overtly supernatural than others, but it was premised on the same belief in divine intervention. God would cause a guilty person to choke on the blessed food, making their guilt manifest. Modern understanding of psychosomatic responses suggests that a guilty person, under extreme stress and believing that God would expose their guilt, might indeed have difficulty swallowing, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The coarsened makes several memorable appearances in historical accounts. According to tradition, Earl Godwin of Wessex died after choking on a coarsened during a dispute with King Edward the Confessor in 1053, though historians debate whether this actually happened or was propaganda spread by Godwin's enemies. Hierarchies of crime and punishment. Medieval criminal law was built on a foundation of profound inequality. The same act could be a minor offense or a capital crime depending on the status of the perpetrator and victim. This was not seen as unjust but as a reflection of natural order. Different classes of people had different rights and responsibilities. A peasant who struck a nobleman might be executed for the offense, while a nobleman who struck a peasant might pay a small fine or suffer no consequence at all. The concept of proportional punishment existed, but proportionality was calculated with reference to social status, not the nature of the act itself. Wergild, or manprice, was a system common in Germanic law where crimes, including murder, could be compensated through payment. The amount varied dramatically based on status. The wergild for a nobleman might be 50 times that for a peasant. This system seems shocking to modern sensibilities, allowing murder to be paid off, but it served to prevent blood feuds and provided support for the victim's family. Women generally had lower wergild than men of the same social class, though in some regions, women of childbearing age had higher wergild because of their value in producing children. Clergy had elevated wergild, reflecting their sacred status. The complex mathematics of medieval wergild charts reveal a society deeply committed to quantifying human worth according to social function and status. Mutilation as punishment. Medieval justice often preferred mutilation to execution or imprisonment. Cutting off a hand, ear, or nose, blinding, or castration were common punishments for various crimes. These punishments were considered merciful alternatives to death while providing visible, permanent markers of criminal status. Thieves might have a hand cut off, both as punishment and as a practical measure to prevent future theft. Counterfeiters might have their hand cut off or be blinded, making it difficult to continue their crime. Forgers might lose the fingers used to write. The punishment was tailored to the crime in a grimly practical way. False witnesses might have their tongues cut off or be branded on the forehead, marking them permanently as unreliable. This served as both punishment and warning. Anyone dealing with them in the future would know they had been convicted of lying. In a society where reputation was everything and written records were limited, these physical markers served as permanent criminal records. Some regions had detailed legal codes specifying exactly which mutilations were appropriate for which crimes. The Anglo-Saxon legal code of King Athelred, for instance, specified, "If anyone plots against the king's life, he shall forfeit his life. If he wishes to clear himself, he shall do so with the king's wergild. If a thief is caught, let him forfeit his life, or let him be redeemed with his wergild." The practice of judicial mutilation declined in the later medieval period, partly due to church influence and partly due to changing attitudes about punishment. By the 15th century, imprisonment and execution were becoming more common, though mutilation persisted for certain crimes well into the early modern period. Sanctuary laws. One of the most peculiar aspects of medieval criminal law was the right of sanctuary. A person accused or guilty of a crime could flee to a church, and as long as they remained there, they could not be arrested. This right was taken extremely seriously. Violating sanctuary was itself a grave crime that could result in excommunication. The right of sanctuary was rooted in ancient religious traditions and recognized in both civil and canon law. Churches, monasteries, and even the grounds around them were considered sacred space where worldly law did not apply. A criminal who reached sanctuary was under the protection of the church and, by extension, God. However, sanctuary was not indefinite. After a certain period, often 40 days, the criminal had to either face justice or abjure the realm, swear to leave the country forever. Those who abjured the realm were given safe passage to the nearest port, wearing distinctive clothing to mark them as protected travelers. If they deviated from the prescribed route or returned to the country, they could be killed on sight. The right of sanctuary created obvious problems. Serious criminals could evade justice simply by reaching a church. Sanctuary seekers sometimes remained in churches for years, living off donations from supporters. Church buildings became, in effect, prisons that the church controlled rather than secular authorities. Various attempts were made to limit sanctuary rights. Some crimes, like sacrilege or treason, were eventually excluded from sanctuary protection. Repeat offenders lost sanctuary rights. The practice gradually declined in the late medieval period and was finally abolished in England in the 17th century, though it persisted longer in some Catholic countries. Ordeals for the dead. Medieval law sometimes extended to the dead in bizarre ways. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, their corpse might be subjected to ordeals to determine the identity of their killer. The most famous of these was the ordeal of the bier, where suspected murderers were required to touch the corpse of their alleged victim. According to widespread belief, a corpse would spontaneously bleed when touched by its murderer, revealing their guilt. This belief was taken seriously enough to be used in courts as evidence. Medical tribunals were convened to examine corpses for signs of supernatural accusation. The ordeal of the bier appears in numerous medieval texts, both legal and literary. In the German poem Das Nibelungenlied, the hero Siegfried's corpse bleeds when approached by his murderer, Hagen. While this is literature, it reflects the real legal belief in corpses' ability to identify their killers. Modern understanding attributes any apparent bleeding to the natural process of decomposition and the release of bodily fluids when a corpse is moved or touched. However, in the medieval worldview, where the line between natural and supernatural was constantly blurred, the bleeding corpse was divine testimony, as reliable as any human witness. Punishment by humiliation. Not all medieval punishments involved physical pain or mutilation. Public humiliation was considered a powerful deterrent and punishment in itself. Stocks and pillories were common features of medieval town squares, where offenders would be locked in place and subjected to public mockery, rotten food, and sometimes worse. Different crimes were associated with specific forms of humiliation. Scolds, women considered too argumentative or gossipy, might be subjected to the ducking stool, where they were dunked repeatedly in water while their neighbors watched and jeered. The scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over the head with a plate that went into the mouth to prevent speech, was another punishment for women deemed too talkative. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through town on a hurdle, a wooden frame, sometimes with the offending loaf hung around their neck. Brewers who sold bad ale might be forced to drink it publicly until they vomited. Corrupt officials might be forced to wear symbols of their corruption. A fraudulent merchant might wear a necklace of false coins. These punishments served multiple purposes. They publicly identified wrongdoers, deterred others from similar crimes, and allowed the community to express its displeasure and reassert social norms. In a society without mass media, public punishment was public theater that communicated moral lessons and reinforced social boundaries. Regulation of taverns and alehouses. Medieval authorities were deeply concerned with taverns and alehouses, which they saw as sources of disorder, vice, and sedition. Elaborate laws governed every aspect of their operation, producing some remarkably strange regulations. In many English towns, ale sellers were required to put out a sign, often an ale stake, a pole with a bush attached, when fresh ale was ready. The absence of such a sign meant no ale was available, and selling ale without displaying the required sign was illegal. This was partly for the convenience of customers, but also allowed authorities to monitor ale production and ensure proper taxation. Some jurisdictions required that tavern doors remain open during business hours so that authorities could see inside and ensure no illegal activity was occurring. Others prohibited women from serving in taverns unless they were the owner's wife or daughter, based on the assumption that female servers would encourage moral laxity. Drinking hours were strictly regulated. Many towns prohibited selling alcohol during church services, particularly on Sundays. Some had curfew laws requiring taverns to close at a specified hour, often marked by a bell. to prevent nighttime disorder. The punishment for violating these laws could include fines, closure of the establishment, and even corporal punishment. The price and quality of ale were also regulated. Ale tasters were appointed to test the quality of ale and ensure it was sold at legally mandated prices. Since bread and ale were staples of the medieval diet, their regulation was considered essential to preventing social unrest. Bakers and brewers who violated price or quality standards faced severe punishments. Marriage laws and restrictions. Medieval marriage law was a complex tangle of religious, civil, and customary regulations that produced many peculiar situations. The Church's claim to exclusive jurisdiction over marriage meant that canon law governed who could marry whom, under what circumstances, and with what consequences. Impediments to marriage were numerous and sometimes bizarre. The degrees of consanguinity, blood relationship, that prohibited marriage were calculated with complex medieval mathematics. Initially, marriage was prohibited within 7 degrees of relationship, which was later reduced to 4, but this still meant that in small communities, finding a legally permissible spouse could be difficult. Affinity, relationship through marriage, also created impediments. If your wife died, you could not marry any of her blood relatives within the prohibited degrees. If you had sex with a woman, even outside marriage, you could not later marry any of her blood relatives. Spiritual relationships also counted. Godparents and their godchildren could not marry, nor could godparents marry their godchildren's parents. The most bizarre impediment was public honesty. If you were engaged to someone, even if the engagement was later broken off, you could not marry any of their blood relatives. This created situations where young people who had never married and never consummated a relationship were nonetheless forbidden from marrying certain people because of previous engagements. Clandestine marriages, those conducted without public announcement or proper ceremony, were technically valid if the parties exchanged vows in the present tense, but the Church strongly discouraged them. This led to endless disputes. Couples would claim to be married based on private vows, while families denied the marriage's validity. The church courts were constantly adjudicating these disputes. Sumptuary laws for food. Just as clothing was regulated to reflect social status, so too was food. What you could eat, when you could eat it, and how many courses you could serve were subject to legal regulation in many medieval jurisdictions. Fast days, when meat consumption was prohibited, were strictly enforced. The medieval calendar included numerous fast days, Fridays, the 40 days of Lent, and various other religious observances. Violating fast day regulations was both a sin and a crime. Butchers who sold meat on fast days could be fined, pilloried, or lose their license. The regulations about fasting were complex and full of exceptions. Fish was permitted on fast days, leading to an elaborate classification of what counted as fish. Beavers, because they lived partly in water, were sometimes classified as fish and permitted on fast days. So were barnacle geese, which medieval people believed spontaneously generated from barnacles in the ocean rather than being born from eggs like other birds. Beyond fasting, some regions had sumptuary laws for feasts. The number of dishes served at a meal, the types of meat, and the use of spices were regulated according to social status. A merchant might be permitted to serve 3 meat dishes at a feast, while a duke could serve 7. Using prohibited foods or exceeding permitted extravagance could result in fines. These laws were motivated partly by religious concerns, gluttony was a sin, and partly by economic concerns, preventing people from bankrupting themselves on lavish feasts. They also served to maintain visible social distinctions. A commoner hosting a feast as lavish as a noble's was seen as improper pretension. Laws governing sleep. Perhaps the strangest category of daily life regulations concerned sleep. Some medieval towns had laws about when people should sleep, ostensibly for public order but reflecting the era's obsession with regulating all aspects of life. Curfew laws required people to be indoors after a certain hour, marked by the ringing of a bell. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. Fires had to be covered or extinguished at curfew to reduce the risk of nighttime fires. Being outside after curfew without good reason could result in arrest. Some regulations went further, prescribing when windows should be shuttered and when lights should be extinguished. These were partly practical, fire prevention and crime reduction, but also reflected the belief that nighttime was dangerous, both physically and spiritually. Nighttime was when demons and evil spirits were most active, and good Christians should be safely indoors. Urban regulations often prohibited certain noisy activities at night. Blacksmiths, for instance, might be prohibited from working after dark because the noise disturbed sleep. Musicians and street performers faced similar restrictions. The right to quiet sleep was taken seriously, and violations could result in fines or physical punishment. Some monasteries and religious communities had elaborate rules about sleep positions and practices. Monks might be required to sleep in their habits, without undressing, to be ready for nighttime prayers. Some rules prohibited sleeping on one's stomach, considered conducive to lustful dreams, and prescribed sleeping on one's back or side. Bathing regulations. Medieval attitudes toward bathing were complex and often misunderstood. While the stereotype of medieval people as dirty is overstated, there were indeed strange laws governing bathing practices. Public bathhouses were common in medieval towns, but they were subject to heavy regulation. Many were segregated by sex, with different days for men and women, though mixed bathing was permitted in some places and times. Bathhouse regulations often required attendance to ensure no immoral activity occurred, as bathhouses had a reputation as sites of prostitution. The church was ambivalent about bathing. While cleanliness was valued, there was concern that bathing, especially in mixed company, could lead to sin. Some religious orders prohibited frequent bathing, considering it a form of self-indulgence. Saint Benedict's rule for monks specified that baths should be offered to the sick as often as necessary, but to the healthy, and especially the young, more seldom. Some towns had specific days when bathing was prohibited, usually Sundays and major religious holidays. The rationale was that time should be devoted to prayer rather than bodily care. Jews were sometimes subject to discriminatory bathing regulations, with restrictions on when and where they could bathe. Medical theories also influenced bathing laws. Some medieval physicians believed that bathing opened the pores and made one vulnerable to disease, particularly during plague outbreaks. This led to regulations prohibiting or restricting bathing during epidemics, the exact opposite of modern hygienic understanding. Guild laws and restrictions. Medieval guilds exercised enormous control over economic life, creating laws that seem remarkably restrictive and anti-competitive to modern eyes. These organizations of craftsmen and merchants regulated every aspect of their trades, from who could practice them to how products could be made and sold. Entry into a guild was strictly controlled. Aspiring craftsmen had to serve lengthy apprenticeships, often 7 years or more, during which they received minimal pay and were subject to the absolute authority of their master. After completing apprenticeship, they became journeymen, working for wages but not yet permitted to open their own shops or train apprentices. To become a master craftsman, the only status that allowed one to operate independently, required producing a masterpiece. a demonstration piece that proved one's skill to the satisfaction of the guild. The guild could reject masterpieces for arbitrary reasons, and in some cases, becoming a master required marrying a master's daughter or widow, effectively making the status hereditary. Guild regulations specified in minute detail how products could be made. The number of threads in a piece of cloth, the ingredients in a pie, the width of a shoe, all were specified by guild rules, with inspectors regularly checking for compliance. Violators faced fines, confiscation of goods, and expulsion from the guild, which meant the end of one's livelihood. Some guild regulations were bizarrely specific. The London Company of Barbers, for instance, had rules about how many times an apprentice could sweep the shop per day and what types of conversations were permitted while working. The Worshipful Company of Spectacle Makers had rules about the exact curvature of lenses and the materials used for frames. Guilds also controlled competition in strange ways. Some prohibited working at night, ostensibly to ensure quality work in good light, but also to prevent any guild member from gaining an advantage through longer working hours. Others prohibited advertising or any form of self-promotion beyond a simple shop sign. Poaching another guild member's customers could result in severe penalties. The most peculiar guild regulations concerned innovation. Many guilds prohibited members from introducing new techniques or products without guild approval. This was justified as maintaining quality standards, but it served to prevent any member from gaining a competitive advantage. The medieval economy was remarkably static, partly because guild rules made innovation illegal. Market regulations and restrictions. Medieval markets were subject to elaborate regulations designed to prevent fraud, ensure fair prices, and maintain public order. These regulations often had unexpected and sometimes absurd consequences. Forestalling, buying goods before they reached the market to resell at a higher price, was illegal in most jurisdictions and considered a serious crime. The punishment could include fines, imprisonment, and confiscation of goods. Similarly, reg raiding, buying goods in a market to immediately resell them at a higher price, and engrossing, buying large quantities of goods to corner the market, were prohibited. These laws were intended to ensure that goods flowed freely to consumers at fair prices, but they created bizarre situations. A merchant who bought grain from a farmer on the road to market could be arrested for forestalling, even if the price was fair. Someone who bought bread at a market and then decided they didn't want it could not legally resell it at the same market. Markets had to be held at licensed locations on licensed days. Holding a market without proper authorization was illegal, even if there was genuine demand. This created monopolies for established markets and prevented the natural growth of new trading centers. Some towns went to great lengths to sabotage rival markets, sometimes resorting to violence or legal chicanery. The assizes of bread and ale were regulations that fixed the prices of these essential commodities based on the cost of grain. When grain prices rose, the price of bread had to rise proportionally. However, rather than simply raising the price, bakers were required to adjust the size of loaves. This led to a complex system where loaves came in different sizes depending on current grain prices, creating endless confusion and opportunities for fraud. Market regulations also governed when and how goods could be sold. In many towns, locals had the right to buy goods during the first hours of the market, with outsiders only permitted to buy later. Some goods could only be sold during specific hours. Fish, being perishable, often had priority and had to be sold first thing in the morning. Usury laws. The medieval church's prohibition on usury, lending money at interest, created one of the most economically significant and bizarre legal situations of the period. The theological basis was clear. Money was meant to facilitate exchange, not to generate more money. Charging interest was sinful, a form of theft, taking payment for something that didn't exist, the passage of time. This prohibition applied to Christians, creating an obvious problem. How could an economy function without the ability to lend money at interest? The result was an elaborate system of legal fictions and workarounds that attempted to comply with the letter of the law while violating its spirit. One common workaround was the dry exchange, where money would be nominally exchanged for a different currency at one location and re-exchanged at another, with the exchange rates set to build in what was effectively interest. Another was partnership arrangements where the lender became a silent partner in a venture, entitled to a share of profits but theoretically sharing in the risk of loss. The penalty for usury could be severe. Convicted usurers could be excommunicated, denied Christian burial, and forced to make restitution. Their wills could be invalidated and their property confiscated. Yet the practice persisted because it was economically necessary, creating a class of people willing to risk legal and spiritual consequences for profit. Jews, not being bound by Christian religious law, were permitted to lend at interest, though they faced their own restrictions and often severe persecution. Christian borrowers resented paying interest to Jewish lenders while being prohibited from engaging in the practice themselves, contributing to anti-Jewish sentiment and violence. Medieval economic theory held that goods had a just price, an objectively fair price based on the labor and materials required to produce them plus a reasonable profit. Charging more than the just price was considered a form of theft, subject to legal penalty. The problem, of course, was determining what the just price actually was. In practice, authorities often set maximum prices for essential goods, particularly during shortages. Merchants who charged more than the legal maximum faced fines, imprisonment, and confiscation of goods. These price controls often backfired spectacularly. During famines, grain merchants who were prohibited from raising prices simply stopped selling grain, hoarding it until the law changed or selling it illegally. Black markets flourished wherever price controls were strictly enforced. Goods subject to price controls often became scarce as producers shifted to making unregulated goods or stopped producing altogether. Some jurisdictions tried to solve this problem with elaborate regulations requiring merchants to sell at controlled prices or face confiscation of their entire inventory. This merely encouraged merchants to hide goods or claim they had none available. The constant struggle between authorities trying to enforce price controls and merchants trying to evade them was a defining feature of medieval economic life. The concept of just price was not entirely without merit. It prevented extreme price gouging during crises and provided a framework for thinking about economic justice. But it fundamentally misunderstood how markets work, leading to endless practical problems and strange legal situations where behavior that was economically rational was legally prohibited. Monopolies and trade restrictions. Medieval authorities routinely granted monopolies over various trades and products, creating artificial scarcity and restricting competition in ways that would be illegal in most modern economies. These monopolies were seen as legitimate exercises of sovereign authority and means of ensuring quality and raising revenue. Royal monopolies covered everything from the production of salt to the brewing of ale to the manufacture of playing cards. Anyone attempting to engage in a monopolized trade without authorization could face severe penalties. These monopolies were often sold or granted as rewards to royal favorites, creating a class of people whose wealth derived entirely from their legally protected position. Some monopolies were particularly strange. In England, the Crown at various times claimed monopolies over the production of starch, the making of maps, the import of certain spices, and numerous other goods and services. These monopolies were often sold to courtiers and investors who had no expertise in the field but could profit from their exclusive legal rights. Cities also claimed monopolies within their jurisdictions. Urban authorities might prohibit rural craftsmen from selling within city walls, reserving the urban market for guild members. Similarly, cities might prohibit residents from buying goods from rural producers, forcing them to buy from urban merchants who paid city taxes. Foreign trade was heavily restricted through staple laws, which required that certain goods could only be traded through specific ports or cities. Wool, England's most important export, could only be exported through certain staple towns where it was inspected, taxed, and sold. Merchants attempting to evade the staple faced confiscation of goods and heavy fines. These restrictions on trade were partly protectionist, favoring local producers over foreign competition, and partly fiscal, as they made taxation and regulation easier. But they also reflected medieval assumptions about economic life, that competition was destructive, that trade was potentially immoral, and that authority should strictly control economic activity to ensure proper social order. Inheritance laws and property rights. Medieval inheritance law was labyrinthine and full of peculiarities that seem bizarre to modern observers. The fundamental principle was primogeniture. The eldest son inherited everything, or nearly everything. This preserved estates intact but created obvious problems for younger sons and daughters. Younger sons often received nothing except perhaps a monetary payment or support for entering the church. Daughters typically received dowries when they married but had no claim to the family estate. This system prevented the fragmentation of property but created a class of dispossessed younger children who had to make their own way in the world. However, primogeniture was not universal. In some regions, property was divided equally among all sons, or even among all children regardless of sex. In others, the youngest son inherited ultimogeniture, the theory being that older sons had time to establish themselves before their father's death while the youngest needed the support of inheritance. Some territories practiced partible inheritance, where property was divided among heirs, leading to ever smaller holdings and gradual impoverishment. This was particularly common in areas under Germanic law. The result was a landscape of tiny, economically unviable farms, contributing to medieval poverty. Women's property rights varied dramatically by region and were always inferior to men's. In some places, married women could own no property. Everything belonged to their husbands. In others, women retained control of their dowries and could own property separately. Widows often had substantial rights, entitled to a portion of their late husband's estate for their lifetime. The strangest inheritance laws concerned illegitimate children. In most jurisdictions, they could inherit nothing, even if acknowledged by their father. Some regions permitted illegitimate children to inherit if their parents later married, legitimation per subsequens matrimonium. The church permitted illegitimate children to inherit church property in some circumstances, but not secular property. Property could also be entailed, legally restricted so it had to pass to specific heirs and could not be sold or divided. This preserved great estates but created legal nightmares when the designated heir died without issue or when families tried to break entails to sell property. The law courts were constantly dealing with inheritance disputes that hinged on complex interpretations of entails made centuries earlier. Even more peculiar than criminal trials of animals was the practice of excommunicating them. The church claimed spiritual authority over all of God's creation, and this apparently included insects. When locusts, weevils, or other pests threatened crops, Ecclesiastical courts might issue formal excommunications, complete with candles, bells, and solemn pronouncements. These excommunications were not purely symbolic. Medieval people believed that animals, as part of God's creation, were subject to spiritual authority. By excommunicating them, the Church was declaring them outside the protection of divine law, which supposedly made them vulnerable to harm or removal. In some cases, the excommunicated animals were given a certain period to leave the area, after which extermination efforts would begin. The theological reasoning behind these practices was complex. If God had given humans dominion over animals, then animals that harmed humans or their property were stepping outside their proper place in the cosmic order. Bringing them to trial or excommunicating them was a way of reasserting that order and demonstrating that all creatures, human and animal alike, were subject to divine and earthly law. Laws protecting animals. Not all medieval animal laws were about punishment. Some regions had surprisingly progressive laws protecting animals from cruelty. These laws were not motivated by modern concepts of animal rights, but by religious and practical considerations. The Church taught that animals, as God's creatures, should not be treated cruelly. Saint Francis of Assisi's teachings about kindness to animals influenced some medieval legal codes. Some regions prohibited certain forms of animal torture or required that working animals be given rest days, particularly on Sundays and holy days. However, these protections were selective and inconsistent. Animals used for food, hunting, or sport were generally excluded from such protections. Bulls could be baited, bears could be fought with dogs, and horses could be ridden to death in battle, all without legal consequence. The protection extended to animals was less about their intrinsic worth and more about maintaining proper order and demonstrating Christian virtue. Liability for animal actions. Medieval law had complex and often contradictory rules about liability for damage caused by animals. If your pig destroyed your neighbor's garden, you might be held liable, but only if the pig had escaped from proper confinement. If the pig was roaming freely, as was common, the neighbor might be held responsible for not adequately protecting his property. Dogs presented particular challenges. A dog that bit someone might be killed, but its owner might or might not be held liable, depending on whether the dog had bitten before, whether the victim had provoked it, and whether the owner had taken reasonable precautions. The concept of one free bite, the idea that owners were not liable for a dog's first attack, originated in this period. Horses, being valuable property, had special status. If a horse kicked someone, liability might depend on whether the horse was known to be vicious, whether proper warnings were given, and the status of the person kicked. A horse kicking a peasant might result in no consequences, while the same horse kicking a noble could result in the horse's destruction and significant compensation to the injured party. The regulation of dress. Medieval Europe was obsessed with using law to enforce social hierarchies, and nowhere was this more evident than in sumptuary laws, regulations governing who could wear what. These laws, which existed in various forms across Europe from the 13th century onward, attempted to ensure that people's clothing reflected their social status. In England, a series of laws beginning in 1337 restricted the wearing of certain fabrics, colors, and styles to particular social classes. Silk, velvet, and cloth of gold were reserved for the nobility. Peasants were forbidden from wearing colors like purple and crimson, which required expensive dyes. Even the length of men's shoes was regulated, with longer points, a fashion of the era, being restricted to higher social classes. The stated rationale for these laws was multifaceted. First, they prevented people from dressing above their station, which was seen as a form of dishonesty presenting oneself as something one was not. Second, they prevented the waste of money on luxurious clothing by those who could ill afford it. Third, they made social status immediately visible, which was considered essential for maintaining proper social order. Enforcement of these laws was sporadic and often ineffective. Wealthy merchants, who had the money to afford luxurious clothing but lacked noble birth, were particular targets and frequent violators. The laws had to be reissued repeatedly, suggesting that compliance was poor. Penalties for violation could include fines, confiscation of the offending garments, and even imprisonment, though actual prosecution was rare. Color restrictions. Certain colors carried specific social and legal meanings in medieval society, and laws regulated their use accordingly. Purple and crimson, both expensive to produce, were generally reserved for royalty and high nobility. In some regions, only the sovereign could wear pure purple, while various shades were assigned to different ranks of nobility. Yellow was problematic in many medieval cultures. In some places, it was associated with Jews, who were sometimes required by law to wear yellow badges or clothing to mark them as outside the Christian community. In other contexts, yellow was associated with cowardice or heresy. Prostitutes in some cities were required to wear yellow as a mark of their profession. Blue underwent a significant shift in meaning during the medieval period. Initially associated with peasants and laborers because of the availability of woad, a plant that produced blue dye, blue gradually became associated with the Virgin Mary and gained prestige. By the later medieval period, blue was a color of nobility, and laws in some regions restricted deep blue fabrics to the upper classes. Heresy laws and their enforcement. The medieval period's most severe laws concerned heresy, holding beliefs that contradicted official church doctrine. Heresy was not merely a religious error but a crime, often punishable by death. The logic was stark. Heresy endangered not just the heretic's soul but the souls of all who might be influenced by heretical teachings. The definition of heresy was surprisingly broad and could encompass beliefs that seemed trivial to modern observers. Questioning transubstantiation, disputing the necessity of confession, suggesting that priests could marry, or arguing that the Bible should be available in vernacular languages, all could be deemed heretical. The line between theological inquiry and heresy was often unclear and subject to political manipulation. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, created a formal legal apparatus for detecting and prosecuting heresy. Inquisitors had extraordinary powers. They could compel testimony, use torture to extract confessions, and condemn people to death. The accused had limited rights and often did not know who had accused them, making defense nearly impossible. The procedure was bizarre by modern standards. Inquisitors would arrive in a town and announce a period of grace, during which people could confess heresy and receive light punishment. After this period, active investigation began. Accusations could come from anyone, including personal enemies. Anonymous denunciations were accepted. Children could testify against parents, servants against masters. Torture was permitted to extract confessions, though technically there were restrictions on its use. Inquisitors were supposed to use torture only if there was already substantial evidence of guilt, only once per accused person, and only with methods that did not cause permanent injury or death. In practice, these restrictions were often ignored or circumvented through creative interpretation. The penalties for heresy varied. Minor offenses might result in public penance, wearing distinctive clothing, or pilgrimage. More serious cases could result in imprisonment, confiscation of property, or death by burning. Burning was chosen because church law prohibited clergy from shedding blood, and burning technically did not shed blood, a legalistic distinction that provided little comfort to the victims. Blasphemy and profanity laws. Closely related to heresy laws were prohibitions on blasphemy, insulting God, Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. Blasphemy was taken extremely seriously, with punishments ranging from fines to mutilation to execution depending on the severity and the jurisdiction. The definition of blasphemy was broad. Swearing oaths that invoked God's name, cursing using religious terms, and even certain common expressions could be prosecuted as blasphemy. Some jurisdictions prohibited specific phrases or required that people report anyone they heard blaspheming. In France, Louis IX, St. Louis, issued strict anti-blasphemy laws in the 13th century. First offenders had their lips burned with hot iron. Repeat offenders could have their tongue cut out. For multiple offenses, the penalty could be death by drowning. These laws were sporadically enforced but remained on the books for centuries. The concept of taking God's name in vain was interpreted literally. Frivolous oaths, swearing by God or the saints to verify minor claims, were prosecuted as blasphemy. Some regions required that all oaths use specific formulas approved by the Church. Using unauthorized oath formulas could result in fines or public penance. Gambling created particular blasphemy concerns because players often swore oaths and cursed when they lost. Some jurisdictions prohibited gambling entirely, while others prohibited it only on holy days. The enforcement of these laws was sporadic, but periodic crackdowns could result in mass arrests and public punishments meant to demonstrate authorities' commitment to suppressing vice. Visual blasphemy was also prosecuted. Creating images of sacred figures that were deemed insufficiently respectful, mocking religious practices through art or theater, or creating parodies of religious ceremonies could all result in blasphemy charges. The boundaries of acceptable religious art were constantly negotiated through prosecutions and controversies. Witchcraft and magic laws. The late medieval period saw an increasing obsession with witchcraft, culminating in the massive witch hunts of the early modern period. Earlier medieval attitudes toward witchcraft had been more skeptical. The Canon Episcopi, a 10th century church document, dismissed belief in witches' powers as superstition. By the 15th century, this skepticism had been replaced by an elaborate demonology that held that witches made pacts with the devil, received supernatural powers, and used those powers to harm their neighbors. Witchcraft became not just a superstitious belief but a heresy and a crime, subject to prosecution by both church and secular courts. The Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, provided a comprehensive guide to detecting, prosecuting, and punishing witches. This text, while controversial even at the time, influenced legal proceedings across Europe. It described in detail how witches operated, how they could be identified, and how they should be interrogated. The crimes attributed to witches were often impossibly bizarre, flying through the air to attend Sabbaths where they worshipped Satan, transforming into animals, causing impotence through curses, stealing penises, which they supposedly kept in nests where they fed them oats, making cattle's milk dry up, causing storms and crop failures, and killing children. Confessions to these crimes were extracted through torture. Evidence standards in witchcraft trials were often reversed. Normal rules of evidence did not apply. The accused might be stripped and searched for witches' marks, supposedly spots where the devil had touched them that felt no pain. Suspects might be subjected to swimming, thrown into water to see if they floated, indicating guilt, or sank, indicating innocence, though they might drown. Siege warfare regulations. Siege warfare, which dominated much of medieval military activity, was governed by a surprising number of legal customs. These rules determined when a siege was justified, how besiegers should conduct themselves, and what happened when a fortress finally fell. The laws of siege hinged on the concept of surrender timing. If a fortress surrendered before the besieging army's banners were raised and siege engines prepared, the garrison was entitled to depart safely with their possessions. If they surrendered after the siege began but before a breach was made in the walls, they could leave safely but without possessions. If they held out until a breach was made and the fortress taken by storm, they forfeited all protections. The besiegers could kill defenders, enslave the population, and pillage freely. This created a grim calculus. Defenders had to judge whether relief was coming and whether they could hold out long enough for it to arrive, balanced against the increasing risks of holding out too long. Attackers, meanwhile, might offer generous terms early in a siege to encourage surrender, avoiding the cost and risk of a prolonged siege or assault. Truces during sieges were common and followed specific rules. A besieging army might allow messengers to leave to seek terms of surrender or to appeal for relief. Supply convoys bringing food to the besieged might be allowed to pass under truce. These truces were usually temporary and limited in scope, but they were generally honored. Violating them was considered dishonorable and could lead to retaliation. The use of certain weapons and tactics was sometimes restricted by custom, though these restrictions were often honored in the breach. Greek fire and other incendiary weapons were sometimes considered illegitimate. Poisoning wells was generally condemned, though it occurred. Trebuchets hurling diseased corpses or excrement into fortresses to spread disease was practiced despite religious objections. The church attempted to regulate siege warfare through various means. Laying siege to churches or monasteries was theoretically prohibited and could result in excommunication. In practice, this prohibition was often ignored, particularly when the religious institution was seen as supporting the enemy. The church also tried to prohibit sieges during religious seasons like Lent, with equally limited success. Protection of non-combatants. Medieval law theoretically protected certain categories of people from the violence of war, though these protections were often more aspirational than actual. Clergy, women, children, pilgrims, merchants, and farmers were all supposed to be immune from military violence. The Peace of God and Truce of God movements, beginning in the 10th century, attempted to limit warfare through ecclesiastical sanctions. The Peace of God prohibited violence against non-combatants, while the Truce of God prohibited warfare during certain times, Sundays, holy days, and eventually most of the week. Violators could be excommunicated. These movements had limited success. They worked best in regions where the church was powerful and where local lords supported them. Where central authority was weak and warriors had little to lose from excommunication, the protections were often ignored. Nonetheless, the movements established principles that influenced later development of the laws of war. Sanctuary rights extended to warfare. People fleeing violence could seek refuge in churches, and attacking them there was sacrilege. This created situations where entire populations would crowd into churches during raids, trusting in the sanctity of the space to protect them. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes raiders violated sanctuary and massacred those within. The concept of quarter, sparing enemies who surrendered, developed gradually during the medieval period. Initially, there was little expectation that common soldiers would be spared. By the late medieval period, customs had developed where soldiers who surrendered would be taken prisoner rather than killed, though this was not universally practiced and depended heavily on circumstances. Violations of these protections were sometimes prosecuted, particularly when the perpetrator was defeated or politically weak. More often, violations went unpunished. The laws protecting noncombatants were thus aspirational frameworks that were honored when convenient and violated when expedient, much like international humanitarian law today. Heraldry and military law. Heraldry, the system of hereditary symbols used to identify knights and nobles, was governed by elaborate laws and customs. Coats of arms were not mere decoration but legal identifiers with the force of trademarks or copyrights. The right to bear arms was restricted to those of noble birth. Commoners who displayed coats of arms without authorization could face prosecution. In England, the court of chivalry had jurisdiction over disputes involving heraldry, and unauthorized use of another's arms could result in fines and orders to cease use. Creating a new coat of arms required following specific rules. The colors, patterns, and symbols used all had meanings and followed grammatical rules. Heralds, royal officials who specialized in heraldry, reviewed and registered coats of arms to ensure they were unique and followed proper forms. Coats of arms served military purposes beyond mere identification. They indicated the bearer's lineage and therefore status. They could signal alliances. Family arms might be quartered with those of powerful allies. They communicated ownership of captured equipment and territory. The entire system of heraldry was thus both a legal framework and a military communication system. Disputes over heraldic rights were taken seriously. If two parties claimed the same coat of arms or sufficiently similar ones, this could lead to legal proceedings before the court of chivalry. The court would examine evidence of prior use, family lineage, and the distinctiveness of the arms in question. Losing such a dispute meant having to abandon one's arms and adopt new ones, a significant humiliation. Illegitimate children faced special heraldic rules. They could not inherit their father's arms but could bear them with specific modifications called marks of cadency or brisures that indicated illegitimate status. These marks permanently identified one's illegitimate lineage, creating a permanent legal and social stigma visible every time one displayed one's arms. Laws governing mercenaries. The medieval period saw the extensive use of mercenaries, creating legal challenges about their status and conduct. Mercenaries existed in a legal gray zone. They were not bound by feudal obligations like knights, nor were they simply criminals, but something in between. Different regions had different laws about hiring mercenaries. Some jurisdictions prohibited hiring foreign mercenaries, seeing them as unreliable and dangerous to social order. Others regulated mercenary contracts, specifying terms of service, payment, and the mercenaries' legal obligations. The Church was deeply ambivalent about mercenaries. The Second Lateran Council of 1139 condemned the use of mercenaries and threatened those who hired them with excommunication. This prohibition was widely ignored, including by the papacy itself, which frequently employed mercenaries. The theoretical ban remained on the books while being violated in practice by all parties. Mercenary companies, organized bands of professional soldiers who contracted their services to the highest bidder, were particularly troublesome. When not employed, these companies often turned to brigandage, pillaging the countryside. Some regions attempted to prohibit mercenary companies or regulate their activities, with limited success. The legal status of captured mercenaries was ambiguous. Unlike noble captives, they had no ransom value. Unlike peasant levies, they were professional soldiers who had chosen military service. They might be executed, enslaved, or released depending on circumstances and the captor's needs. There was no consistent legal framework governing their treatment. Some mercenaries achieved semi-legitimate status through incorporation into official military forces or by receiving grants of land in exchange for service. The Varangian Guard in Byzantine service and the Swiss Guards in Papal service were mercenaries who gained official recognition and legal protection. Most mercenaries, however, remained in legal limbo, their status and rights uncertain. Feudal tenure and obligations. The feudal system created a complex web of property relationships that seem bizarre to modern observers accustomed to simple ownership. In medieval law, all land ultimately belonged to the sovereign, and all others merely held it in tenure, subject to various obligations and restrictions. Holding land came with military obligations. A knight's fee, the amount of land needed to support a knight, carried the obligation to provide military service for a specified period each year. Failure to fulfill military obligations could result in forfeiture of the land. This system created situations where land ownership was conditional and temporary rather than absolute. The obligations extended beyond military service. Landholders owed various forms of feudal dues: harriet, the best beast when a tenant died; relief, a payment when an heir inherited; and aid, payments for special occasions like knighting the lord's son or ransoming the lord if captured. These obligations meant that land generated not just agricultural income but a stream of payments to overlords. Tenure types proliferated, each with its own rules and obligations. Knight service was the most prestigious form of tenure. Socage, a free tenure requiring agricultural labor or other non-military service, was more common. Villenage required work on the lord's land and carried significant restrictions on the tenant's freedom. The most peculiar tenures were the sergeanties, lands held in exchange for performing specific, sometimes bizarre services for the king. Grand sergeanty involved significant services like serving as the king's champion or providing soldiers. Petty sergeanty involved minor services, sometimes quite strange. Some lands were held in exchange for providing specific items at the coronation, serving as the king's taster, or performing other ceremonial duties. These tenure relationships created multiple layers of obligation. A person might hold land from a lord, who held it from a greater lord, who held it from the king. Each relationship carried obligations, meaning that a piece of land supported a pyramid of claims. Disputes about these relationships filled the law courts. Forest law. Royal forests covered much of medieval England and were governed by a separate, harsh legal code designed to preserve game for royal hunting. Forest law was so distinctive and so severe that it deserves special mention among weird medieval laws. The term forest in medieval law did not necessarily mean wooded land. It referred to any area under forest law, which could include fields, moors, and villages. Within these areas, a draconian code prohibited numerous activities that would have been legal elsewhere. Hunting or taking game in royal forests was a capital offense, at least in theory. In practice, punishments varied, but they could include death, mutilation, particularly blinding, or heavy fines. Even taking dead wood or fallen timber without permission could result in punishment, as could grazing animals or clearing land. The definition of game protected by forest law was broad. Deer were obviously protected, but so were wild boar, hares, rabbits, and various birds. The penalty for killing different types of game varied, but all were protected to some degree. Even disturbing game, making noise that frightened deer, for instance, could be punished. Forest law created its own court system with its own officials. Verderers, foresters, and agisters enforced forest law and brought violators before forest courts. These courts met periodically and were notoriously harsh. Being subject to forest law was widely resented, and when King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, one of its provisions limited the extent of forest law. The attachment of hunting dogs in forest areas was required by law. Dogs had to be lawed or expedited, having 3 claws cut from one front paw to prevent them from chasing game. Dog owners who failed to law their dogs could be fined. The cruelty of this practice was apparently outweighed by the importance of protecting royal game. Forest law gradually declined in importance and severity as royal authority centralized and hunting became less economically significant. But at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, forest law created a parallel legal system that governed vast areas and significantly restricted the population's freedom. Common rights and disputes. Medieval property law included an elaborate system of common rights, customary privileges to use resources on land one did not own. These rights, which seem strange in a modern context of absolute private property, were economically essential to medieval communities. Right of common pasture allowed villagers to graze animals on common land or on privately held land after harvest. Right of turbary permitted cutting peat for fuel. Right of estovers allowed taking wood for necessary purposes like repairing homes or making tools. Right of pannage permitted pigs to forage for acorns and beechnuts in forests. These rights were carefully defined and regulated by local custom. The number of animals one could pasture might be limited. Wood taking might be restricted to specific times and purposes. Pigs could only forage during specific months. Violating the limitations on common rights could result in fines or forfeiture of the privileges. Proving common rights in disputes was challenging. They were based on custom rather than written grants, so evidence consisted largely of testimony about traditional practice. Elderly villagers would be questioned about what rights had been exercised time out of mind, for as long as anyone could remember. If a right had been exercised without challenge for long enough, it acquired legal force. Enclosure, the practice of fencing off common land to convert it to private use, was a constant source of conflict. Landowners who enclosed common land eliminated villagers' customary rights, often causing severe hardship. Villagers sometimes responded by tearing down enclosures, leading to cycles of enclosure, destruction, and legal action. The law on enclosure was complex and varied by region. Some enclosures were legal if proper procedures were followed and compensation paid. Others were illegal but difficult to reverse once accomplished. The struggle over enclosure rights continued throughout the medieval period and beyond, representing a fundamental conflict between communal custom and private property rights. Mortmain and dead hand. Mort, literally dead hand, referred to land held by the church or other corporate bodies that never died and therefore never owed feudal dues at inheritance. This created a significant legal and economic problem as more land fell under ecclesiastical control. When an individual held land, they owed various payments to their lord when they died or when their heir inherited. But churches and monasteries never died, and land granted to them was permanently removed from this cycle of payments. Moreover, church land could not be seized for debt or forfeited for treason, further limiting lords' control. As ecclesiastical landholding expanded, secular lords saw their income decline. Tenant-in-chief owing military service to the crown might grant land to the church, permanently eliminating the military obligation. The Statute of Mortmain, enacted in England in 1279, prohibited granting land to the church without royal license, attempting to halt this drain on feudal revenues. The statute was widely evaded through various legal fictions. Land might be granted to trustees who would allow the church to use it while technically retaining ownership. Fines could be paid for retrospective licenses. Ecclesiastical institutions found creative ways to acquire land while nominally complying with mortmain restrictions. Later statutes expanded mortmain restrictions to include other corporate bodies. Universities, guilds, and municipal corporations were also prohibited from acquiring land without license. The underlying concern was the same. Corporate bodies never died and therefore disrupted the feudal system of tenure and obligation. Mortmain law created bizarre situations where beneficial charitable donations were prohibited or heavily taxed to prevent disruption of feudal relationships. The conflict between religious and charitable purposes on one hand and the economic needs of the feudal system on the other was never fully resolved in the medieval period. Dower and marriage property. Dower law governed widows' rights to their deceased husband's property, creating a complex system that balanced women's need for support against heirs' property rights. The rules were intricate and varied by region, but the general principle was that widows were entitled to support from their late husband's estates. In England, common law dower typically entitled a widow to a life interest in 1/3 of all lands her husband had owned during the marriage. This was automatic and could not be eliminated by the husband's will. The widow did not own the land but could use it and take its income for her lifetime, after which it passed to the husband's heirs. Calculating dower was complex. What lands counted? Only those owned outright or also those held in various forms of tenure? What if the husband had sold land during the marriage? Could the widow claim dower from the buyer? These questions generated endless litigation and created uncertainty about property titles. Some regions used different systems. In some parts of Europe, widows inherited a fixed portion of their husband's property outright rather than receiving a life interest. Others had marriage property regimes where property was considered jointly owned by husband and wife, with the widow inheriting a share. The variety of systems meant that marriage property law varied dramatically across relatively small distances. Jointure was an alternative to dower where specific property was designated to support the widow, often through a prenuptial agreement. Jointure could provide more or less than dower depending on the arrangement. Jointure could provide more or less than dower depending on the arrangement. Wealthy families used jointure to control how property passed through generations, while dower's automatic operation made it attractive for less wealthy widows who might not have bargaining power for favorable jointure terms. Conflicts between dower rights and the interests of heirs were constant. Heirs might pressure widows to relinquish dower in exchange for a lump sum payment. Widows might demand more than their dower rights. Courts spent enormous amounts of time adjudicating these disputes, which touched on property law, family law, and gender relations. Guild regulation of daily urban life. Medieval cities were dominated by guilds that regulated far more than just their members' trades. Guild rules extended into members' personal lives, creating a level of control that seems extraordinary to modern sensibilities. Many guilds required members to live in specific neighborhoods, attend guild religious services, and participate in guild social functions. Failure to attend guild meetings or guild members' funerals could result in fines. Guilds regulated members' clothing, prohibiting displays of wealth that might create jealousy or distinctions between members. The surveillance extended to members' family lives. Some guilds prohibited members from marrying without guild approval, ensuring that marriages aligned with guild interests. Disputes between guild members, even over personal matters, had to be arbitrated within the guild before being taken to external courts. Guild regulations often required members to report other members' violations. failing to report a violation could itself be punished. This created an atmosphere of mutual surveillance where guild members monitored each other's conduct in both professional and personal matters. The most extreme guild regulations concerned competition. Members might be prohibited from advertising, from operating shops in certain locations, from working longer hours than other members, or from offering better terms to customers. The goal was complete equality among guild members, even if this meant reduced competition and innovation. Expulsion from a guild was economically devastating, as it prohibited practicing one's trade. Guild membership was therefore leverage that could be used to enforce conformity in many aspects of life beyond the trade itself. The guilds thus functioned as comprehensive regulatory bodies governing their members' entire existence. Market and fair regulations. Medieval markets and fairs operated under detailed regulations meant to ensure honesty, prevent fraud, and maintain order. These regulations could be remarkably specific and sometimes quite strange. The concept of market overt, open market, created special legal status for goods sold in authorized markets during market hours. Purchases in market overt were protected even if the seller didn't own the goods, creating an exception to normal property law. This encouraged market trade but also created opportunities for thieves to launder stolen goods. Market regulations specified where different goods could be sold. Fish might be sold in one location, bread in another, livestock in a third. These specifications were meant to facilitate inspection and prevent confusion but created rigid geographical divisions within markets. Time regulations were equally detailed. Markets might open and close at specific times marked by bells or horns. Forestalling, buying goods before market opening, was prohibited. Some goods could only be sold during specific hours, giving locals first chance to buy before outsiders were permitted to purchase. Quality inspections were mandatory for many goods. Bread had to be weighed and sold at prices determined by the size of bread. Leather had to be inspected by official leather searchers. Wine and ale were tested by official tasters. The systems of inspection created bureaucracies of officials whose livelihood depended on finding violations. Fair courts, courts of pie powder, pieds poudres, dusty feet, operated during major fairs to provide rapid justice for commercial disputes. These courts used simplified procedures to resolve disputes quickly, recognizing that merchants needed prompt resolution to continue trading. The verdicts of pie powder courts could be enforced across jurisdictions, creating a form of international commercial law. Building and construction laws. Medieval cities regulated building construction in surprising detail, motivated by concerns about fire, structural safety, and neighborhood relations. These regulations created extensive bureaucracies and generated significant litigation. Party walls, shared walls between buildings, were governed by complex rules about cost sharing, maintenance obligations, and structural modifications. Disputes about party walls were common and could become quite heated, as modifications by one owner could affect the structural integrity of the neighbor's building. Height restrictions prevented buildings from overshadowing neighbors' property or blocking light to streets. Some cities had rules about how far buildings could project over streets, limiting upper floors that extended beyond the ground floor. These regulations reflected concerns about fire spread and the need to maintain some light and air circulation in crowded medieval streets. Drainage regulations attempted to manage the constant problem of waste and water in cities lacking modern sanitation. Property owners might be required to maintain gutters and sewers to prevent water from draining onto neighbors' property and to avoid blocking common drainage ways. Violations could result in fines and orders to correct the problem. Building materials were regulated to reduce fire risk. After major fires, cities sometimes prohibited thatched roofs or required stone construction in certain areas. These regulations were often difficult to enforce, as mandated materials were more expensive, and compliance was sporadic until another fire prompted renewed enforcement efforts. Sanitation and waste disposal laws. Medieval cities struggled with sanitation, and the laws attempting to address these problems ranged from sensible to bizarre. The basic challenge was disposing of human and animal waste, garbage, and industrial effluent in densely populated areas without modern sewerage systems. Many cities prohibited throwing waste into streets, though enforcement was difficult and the practice continued. Specific times might be designated when waste could be emptied into streets, often at night, with the assumption that rain would eventually wash it away. The cry of "Gardes l'eau," watch out for the water, warned pedestrians of waste about to be thrown from upper windows. Keeping pigs in cities was variously regulated. Some cities prohibited it entirely, others required that pigs be confined rather than allowed to roam freely. Pigs were useful for consuming garbage but also created hazards and sanitation problems. The regulations reflected this ambivalence, constantly adjusting between prohibition and controlled permission. Butchers and tanners, whose trades created significant waste and odor, faced special regulations. They might be required to operate in specific locations, usually downwind from residential areas. Butchers were required to properly dispose of blood and offal, often by throwing it into rivers, creating different environmental problems. Public latrines existed in some cities, governed by regulations about construction, maintenance, and use. Private latrines, generally cesspits, required periodic emptying by gongfirmers, night soil collectors, a profession governed by its own regulations about when they could work, usually at night, and where they could dispose of the collected waste. The most peculiar sanitation laws concerned specific waste products. Dyers, whose work created noxious chemical waste, faced regulations about disposing of their effluent. Fishmongers had rules about disposing of fish waste. Each trade that created distinctive waste products faced its own set of regulations, creating a complex patchwork of sanitation law. Civic order and morality regulations. Medieval cities attempted to regulate moral behavior through law, creating extensive codes governing everything from prostitution to gambling to public drunkenness. These laws reflected both practical concerns about public order and religious anxieties about sin. Prostitution was generally tolerated but heavily regulated. Many cities designated specific districts where prostitution was permitted and prohibited it elsewhere. Prostitutes might be required to wear distinctive clothing, live in specific areas, and observe curfews. They were prohibited from wearing certain colors or fabrics reserved for respectable women. Bathhouses, which were often associated with prostitution, faced detailed regulation. Some cities segregated bathhouses by sex, others prohibited mixed bathing on certain days, still others attempted to prohibit any sexual activity in bathhouses while acknowledging it would occur anyway. The regulations reflect deep ambivalence about bathhouses' dual function as places of hygiene and venues for sex work. Gambling was generally prohibited or heavily restricted, though enforcement varied. Cards and dice were particular targets of anti-gambling laws. Some cities allowed gambling only during specific times or in specific locations. The church condemned gambling, seeing it as encouraging idleness and vice. But gambling remained popular and regulations were often ineffective. Public drunkenness was prosecuted, though the line between acceptable drinking and punishable intoxication was unclear. Habitual drunkards might face escalating punishments: fines, time in stocks, public humiliation, and eventually banishment from the city. These laws were enforced erratically, often being used selectively against people who were already socially marginal. Curfew laws prohibited being on streets after specified hours without good reason. Night watchmen patrolled to enforce curfews and investigate anyone out after hours. Legitimate travelers could be detained until morning, while those without plausible explanations faced arrest. Curfews reflected fear of nighttime crime but also broader anxieties about the dangers lurking in darkness. Restrictions on testamentary freedom. Medieval law severely restricted people's ability to dispose of their property through wills. The modern concept of testamentary freedom, the ability to leave your property to whomever you choose, was largely unknown. Instead, complex rules determined how property had to be divided. In many regions, a person could only freely dispose of 1/3 of their property by will. Another third automatically went to the widow, and the final third was divided among children. This reasonable parts system prevented disinheriting family members and ensured that property remained within families. Primogeniture meant that land typically passed to the eldest son regardless of the testator's wishes. Attempts to circumvent primogeniture through creative will drafting were generally unsuccessful. The legal and social pressure to preserve estates intact and pass them to eldest sons was overwhelming. Illegitimate children generally could not inherit, even if explicitly named in a will. Similarly, attempting to leave property to religious institutions often failed due to mortmain restrictions. Wills that violated these rules might be partially or wholly invalidated. The formalities required for valid wills were strict and often bizarre. Wills had to be witnessed by a specific number of people, sometimes had to be read aloud, and often required formal publication after death. Failure to follow proper formalities could invalidate an otherwise clear expression of testamentary intent. The Church claimed jurisdiction over wills, at least regarding movable property, creating conflicts with secular courts about will interpretation and enforcement. This jurisdictional confusion meant that will disputes might be heard in multiple courts with potentially conflicting results. Deathbed customs and laws. The moments before and after death were governed by elaborate customs that sometimes had legal force. The presence of appropriate witnesses, the making of proper declarations, and the observance of religious rituals could all have legal consequences. Deathbed gifts, property transferred in anticipation of death, occupied an uncertain legal position. They might be treated as completed gifts, as advance inheritances, or as testamentary dispositions requiring the formalities of wills. Disputes about deathbed gifts were common, with heirs often claiming that purported gifts were invalid. The custom of deathbed confessions, while primarily religious, had legal implications. Confessions of crimes, acknowledgments of debts, and revelations of secret marriages or illegitimate children could affect property distribution and legal rights. The testimony of those present at deathbeds was therefore legally significant. Some regions required that debts be paid before any property could pass to heirs, giving creditors priority over family. This could leave widows and children destitute if the deceased had significant debts. The tension between protecting creditors and protecting families was never fully resolved. The timing of death could have legal significance. Dying before or after certain dates might determine which law applied to property distribution. If a landowner died owing military service before completing it, the heir might owe additional payments. The exact moment of death could thus have significant legal and financial consequences. Burial rights and obligations. Medieval law regulated burial in surprising detail, reflecting the importance of proper burial to medieval Christians. The right to burial in consecrated ground was not automatic and could be denied for various reasons. Suicides were denied Christian burial in most jurisdictions, based on the Church's teaching that suicide was a grave sin. The bodies of suicides might be buried at crossroads with stakes through their hearts, reflecting beliefs about preventing their ghosts from walking. Property of suicides was often forfeited to the lord or crown, adding financial penalty to spiritual condemnation. Excommunicates, heretics, and those who died unconfessed also faced burial restrictions. They might be buried in unconsecrated ground outside churchyards, marking them as outside the Christian community even in death. Families sometimes went to great lengths to secure Christian burial for such individuals, including concealing the circumstances of death. The location of burial was governed by rules about parish membership and payments. Generally, people had to be buried in their parish churchyard, which meant paying fees to the parish priest. Attempts to be buried elsewhere, perhaps in a more prestigious church, required special permission and often additional payments. Burial positions within churchyards reflected social status. Burial inside the church was reserved for nobility and wealthy donors. Position within the churchyard also mattered. Some locations were considered more desirable than others. The regulation of burial location thus reinforced social hierarchies even in death. The most bizarre burial regulations concerned burial depth and the reuse of graves. Some regulations specified minimum burial depths to prevent bodies from being exposed by animals or erosion. The practice of digging up older remains to make room for new burials was governed by rules about how long remains had to stay buried before being moved to charnel houses. Laws of mourning and inheritance ceremonies. The period following death was governed by elaborate rules about mourning behavior and inheritance ceremonies. These rules had legal force and could affect property rights. Widows faced strict regulations about mourning dress and behavior. They were expected to wear specific mourning clothing for specified periods, sometimes up to a year. Remarrying too quickly could result in social condemnation and even legal penalties, including forfeiture of dower rights. Inheritance ceremonies, particularly for land, often required specific rituals to complete the transfer of ownership. An heir might have to appear before the manorial court and be formally admitted to the land. Until this ceremony was completed, the inheritance was not final, creating a liminal period where ownership was uncertain. Some regions required heirs to pay fees or perform services before inheriting. The Harriet, surrendering the best beast or best possession to the Lord, was one such payment. Relief, a payment roughly equal to 1 year's income from the land, was another. These payments had to be made promptly or the inheritance could be forfeited. The reading of wills was often a public ceremony with specific formalities. Interested parties had to be notified, and the reading had to occur at a specified time and place. Failing to properly publish a will could provide grounds for challenging it. Funeral feasts were sometimes regulated by sumptuary laws that specified appropriate levels of expenditure based on social status. These regulations attempted to prevent families from bankrupting themselves on lavish funerals while also ensuring that funerals appropriately reflected the deceased's social standing. Benefit of clergy. One of the strangest aspects of medieval law was the benefit of clergy, the right of clergy to be tried in church courts rather than secular courts for criminal offenses. This privilege had profound implications and was subject to significant abuse. The initial logic was simple. Clergy, as members of a separate ecclesiastical order, should be judged by ecclesiastical superiors rather than secular authorities. This reflected the Church's claim to independence from secular power. Church courts, however, could not impose death penalties, based on the principle that the Church did not shed blood, so clergy effectively received lighter punishments for serious crimes. The definition of clergy expanded far beyond ordained priests. Minor clerics, monks, students at universities, and eventually anyone who could read could claim benefit of clergy. The standard test was reading a passage from the Bible, usually Psalm 51 verse 1, the neck verse, so called because reading it saved one's neck. This meant that literacy became a get-out-of-jail card. The benefit of clergy was limited in various ways over time. Some serious crimes were eventually excluded. Repeat offenders lost the privilege. Those claiming benefit of clergy might be branded to mark them as having used the privilege once, preventing repeated use. But the privilege persisted, creating a dual system of justice based on literacy and status. The journey through medieval Europe's legal landscape reveals a world that seems simultaneously alien and familiar. These laws, which strike modern observers as bizarre, arbitrary, or even darkly comic, were the products of a society operating under fundamentally different assumptions about justice, order, and the proper relationship between individuals, communities, and divine authority. The logic behind the madness. What appears as medieval legal oddity becomes more comprehensible when viewed through the lens of medieval worldview. The trial of animals, seemingly absurd to us, reflected a cosmic order where all creation was subject to law and justice. The elaborate sumptuary regulations arose from a society that believed visible social hierarchies were divinely ordained and essential to proper functioning. Trial by ordeal made perfect sense to people who believed in an actively interventionist God who would reveal truth through supernatural signs. These laws were not the products of ignorance or irrationality, but rather of a different rationality, one built on religious authority, hierarchical social structures, communal reputation, and the blurred boundary between natural and supernatural. Medieval people were no less intelligent than we are. They simply operated within a different framework of assumptions about how the world worked. The synthesis of legal traditions. Medieval law's peculiarity stems partly from its composite nature. Roman legal sophistication collided with Germanic tribal customs, overlaid with Christian canon law, and modified by centuries of local custom. This created a legal patchwork where multiple, often contradictory systems coexisted uneasily. A single dispute might be governed by different laws depending on whether it was heard in manorial courts, royal courts, ecclesiastical courts, or merchant courts. This legal pluralism created both flexibility and confusion. It allowed medieval society to adapt Roman concepts to post-imperial conditions while preserving tribal customs and incorporating Christian doctrine. But it also created situations where justice depended less on the merits of a case than on which court system one accessed and which legal tradition applied. The role of inequality. Perhaps no feature of medieval law seems stranger to modern sensibilities than its profound, systematic inequality. The same act could be a minor offense or a capital crime depending on the status of perpetrator and victim. Different classes of people literally lived under different laws, with different rights, obligations, and protections. This inequality was not seen as unjust but as reflecting natural order. Medieval society was organized around the principle of hierarchy. Everyone had their proper place, from the king at the top to the peasant at the bottom, with elaborate gradations between. Law existed not to create equality but to maintain this hierarchical order. Justice meant everyone receiving what was appropriate to their station, not everyone being treated the same. This principle extended to all areas of law. Property law reflected hierarchical tenure relationships. Criminal law calibrated punishment to status. Sumptuary law enforced visible distinction. Even marriage law treated nobles differently from commoners. The law was a tool for maintaining social order, and that order was fundamentally unequal. Religious permeation of law. The overwhelming influence of Christianity on medieval law cannot be overstated. The church was not merely a religious institution but a legal one, with its own courts, procedures, and punishments. Canon law governed vast areas of life, from marriage to inheritance to moral behavior. Sin and crime were often indistinguishable, and punishment served both temporal and spiritual purposes. This religious dimension explains many of medieval law's strangest features. Benefit of clergy reflected the church's claim to exclusive jurisdiction over its members. Sanctuary rights demonstrated the superior authority of sacred space over secular power. Heresy prosecutions showed the priority of spiritual over physical welfare. Excommunication of pests illustrated the belief that all creation was subject to divine law. Even apparently secular laws had religious dimensions. Oath-taking invoked God as witness. Trial by ordeal called on divine judgment. Market regulations enforced fast day observances. The entire legal system was embedded in a Christian cosmology where earthly law was meant to reflect heavenly order. The absence of modern concepts. Many medieval laws seem bizarre because they operated in the absence of legal concepts we now take for granted. The presumption of innocence, the right to representation, protection against self-incrimination, proportional punishment, equal protection. These principles were unknown or poorly developed. Instead, medieval law relied on reputation, community standing, oath-taking, and supernatural signs. Evidence as we understand it was often secondary to character witnesses. Guilt could be determined by one's ability to find oath helpers or survive an ordeal rather than by examination of facts. Punishment varied wildly based on status rather than the nature of the offense. This alternative framework made sense in medieval society's context. In small, stable communities where everyone knew everyone else, reputation was indeed meaningful information. In a world where written records were scarce, oral testimony and oath-taking were necessary. In a religious culture, divine judgment through ordeal seemed logical. These methods appear arbitrary to us but served genuine functions in their context. Economic and social control. Many seemingly bizarre laws were actually tools of economic and social control. Guild regulations that appear to stifle competition were designed to prevent any member from gaining advantage over others, maintaining stability even at the cost of innovation. Market regulations prevented forestalling and engrossing to ensure food reached consumers at fair prices, even when this created inefficiencies. Sumptuary laws prevented social climbing by making status visible and preventing people from dressing above their station. Inheritance laws preserved estates intact even when this meant disinheriting younger children. These laws reflected medieval priorities: stability over growth, community over individual, preservation of existing order over social mobility. The modern emphasis on economic efficiency, competition, and individual opportunity would have seemed destructive to medieval observers. Their laws prioritized different values: order, stability, tradition, community cohesion, even when this meant sacrificing what we would consider economic rationality or individual freedom. The human element. Behind these strange laws were human beings trying to create order in a difficult, often brutal world. Medieval life was precarious. Disease, famine, war, and early death were constant threats. Law provided structure and predictability in an unpredictable world. Even laws that seem harsh or arbitrary often served the function of maintaining social cohesion and providing mechanisms for resolving disputes. The emotional and psychological needs that law served are visible throughout these regulations. Animal trials allowed communities to process grief and trauma through familiar legal procedures. Sanctuary rights provided hope of mercy even for serious criminals. Elaborate mourning regulations helped people navigate loss. Strict market regulations reduced anxiety about fraud and shortage. Law was not merely an instrument of power, but a tool for managing the fears and needs of medieval life. The legacy. Medieval law's influence persists in unexpected ways. Common law systems still bear traces of medieval procedures and concepts. Property law retains vestiges of feudal tenure. Criminal law's distinction between felonies and misdemeanors originated in medieval classifications. Even abolished practices like benefit of clergy shaped legal development in lasting ways. More broadly, medieval law reminds us that legal systems are culturally contingent, shaped by the assumptions and priorities of their societies. What seems natural and just to one era appears bizarre to another. Our own legal system will likely seem strange to future observers, just as medieval law seems strange to us. Reflection on justice. Examining medieval weird laws raises fundamental questions about justice itself. Were medieval people wrong to believe in trial by ordeal, or were they simply operating under different epistemological assumptions? Was their embrace of legal inequality unjust by absolute standards, or only by the standards of modern egalitarian ideology? Can we judge their laws without imposing anachronistic values? These questions have no easy answers. We can recognize that medieval law often caused suffering through harsh punishments, systematic discrimination, and arbitrary procedures. But we should also acknowledge that medieval people were trying, within their framework, to achieve justice, maintain order, and serve communal needs. Their solutions differ from ours because their problems, priorities, and worldview differed. The persistence of strangeness. Even understanding the context and logic of medieval law, much of it remains genuinely strange. The excommunication of locusts, the ordeal of the cross, the trial of pigs dressed in human clothing, these practices retain their capacity to surprise and perplex. This strangeness is valuable, reminding us that human societies can operate in radically different ways and that our current legal assumptions are not inevitable or universal. The study of medieval weird laws serves multiple purposes. It illuminates a fascinating historical period, helping us understand how medieval people thought about justice, order, and community. It provides perspective on our own legal system, highlighting what is contingent versus universal in law. It demonstrates human creativity in developing social institutions, even when those institutions seem bizarre to outside observers. Final thoughts. Medieval Europe's legal landscape was a complex tapestry woven from Roman tradition, Germanic custom, Christian theology, and centuries of accumulated precedent. The result was a system that seems wonderfully strange to modern eyes, full of animal trials, supernatural ordeals, elaborate hierarchies, and minute regulations of daily life. These laws were neither simply barbaric nor merely quaint curiosities. They were serious attempts by medieval people to create order, administer justice, and organize society according to their understanding of proper social and cosmic order. That their solutions differ so dramatically from ours reflects not medieval inferiority but the profound differences in worldview that separate us from them. The medieval period's weird laws thus serve as both historical artifacts and philosophical provocations. They show us how a different society approached fundamental problems of justice and order. They remind us that legal systems are cultural constructs, shaped by the assumptions and priorities of their times. And they demonstrate that what seems natural and inevitable in law is often historically contingent and culturally specific. Understanding these strange laws requires imaginative sympathy, the ability to see the world as medieval people saw it, where God actively intervened in human affairs, where social hierarchy was divinely ordained, where community reputation mattered more than individual rights, and where the supernatural was as real as the natural. Only by entering this worldview can we truly comprehend why people put pigs on trial, subjected accused criminals to ordeals of fire and water, excommunicated swarms of locusts, and regulated the length of shoe points by social class. In the end, the study of medieval weird laws is an exercise in understanding human diversity. It shows us that societies can organize justice and law in radically different ways while still serving genuinely human needs for order, fairness, and community. Medieval law, for all its strangeness, was a human creation addressing human problems, just as our law is today. The differences remind us of how far we've traveled. The similarities remind us of what remains constant in the human experience across centuries.